50,000 residents lived stacked 20 stories high across just 6.4 acres. Kowloon Walled City was a sovereign anomaly, a dense urban organism existing outside the jurisdiction of both British Hong Kong and mainland China. For decades, formal police and government services were non-existent inside its walls. This jurisdictional vacuum created the most densely populated place on Earth, reaching 3.2 million people per square mile. The city was not built by architects or planners. It grew organically, floor by floor, relying entirely on the ingenuity and mutual dependence of its inhabitants. Buildings were constructed without permits, often cantilevered over existing structures, creating a labyrinthine network of dark alleyways and interconnected rooftops. This unique environment demonstrated a radical form of self-organization, where the necessity of survival dictated cooperation, even as it fostered a thriving shadow economy. The city operated under its own rules, a testament to spontaneous order in extreme confinement. The city's unique status originated with the 1898 Convention for the Extension of Hong Kong Territory. While Britain leased the new territories for 99 years, the walled city remained a Chinese enclave, intended to house a Chinese official. After the 1940s, China ceased to assert administrative control, and Britain maintained a policy of non-intervention to avoid diplomatic conflict. This created a legal gray zone, effectively a lawless territory. Attempts by the British to clear the area in 1948 were met with mass resistance, solidifying the squatters' control. By the 1950s, the population exploded, driven by refugees and the lack of building codes. The absence of state regulation meant that every structure was technically illegal, yet the entire community relied on this illegality to exist. The architecture of the walled city was defined by necessity and improvisation. Structures were built using cheap, readily available materials, primarily concrete and steel. Since no single entity controlled construction, buildings were erected adjacent to and on top of each other, often sharing walls and foundations. This resulted in a single, massive, interconnected megastructure. The average building height stabilized around 14 stories after 1970, constrained by the proximity of Kai Tak Airport's flight path, which imposed a height restriction. Internal alleyways were perpetually dark, receiving minimal sunlight, forcing residents to rely on fluorescent lighting 24 hours a day. Rooftops became crucial communal spaces for recreation, drying laundry, and accessing the limited sunlight. In the absence of formal policing, order was initially maintained by powerful triad societies, particularly the 14K and Sun Yi On. These groups controlled the lucrative illegal markets, gambling dens, opium parlors, and prostitution rings. While they enforced their own brutal form of justice, they also provided a rudimentary system of dispute resolution and protection for businesses that paid tribute. By the 1970s, Hong Kong police began conducting targeted raids, significantly reducing the triad's control over daily life. However, the informal economy persisted, relying on the city's isolation from regulatory oversight. Residents often preferred to settle minor disputes internally rather than risk involving the external, often hostile Hong Kong authorities. The walled city functioned as a hub for unregulated manufacturing and services. Small factories produced goods like fish balls and plastic toys, benefiting from extremely low overhead and zero regulatory compliance. Unlicensed dentists and doctors operated clinics, offering cheaper services than those available in Hong Kong, attracting patients from outside the city. These businesses thrived because they could ignore sanitation standards, labor laws, and taxation. This economic model exemplifies a pure free market operating without state intervention, demonstrating high productivity alongside severe health and safety risks. The density itself facilitated rapid material and information exchange necessary for these small-scale operations.
Providing essential services required immense collective effort. The city lacked centralized water and sewage systems. Water was primarily sourced from 70 deep wells drilled by residents, requiring complex shared pumping systems to lift water to rooftop tanks. Electricity was often illegally tapped from the Hong Kong power grid, creating a dangerous tangle of exposed wires throughout the alleyways. Maintenance of these vital, improvised systems relied on mutual aid and informal agreements between neighbors and building owners. This spontaneous infrastructure management highlights the capacity for complex technical organization without centralized planning, driven solely by immediate necessity and localized knowledge. The walled city is frequently analyzed through the lens of anarchism and spontaneous order theory. It demonstrates that complex societies can organize and sustain themselves without formal state apparatuses, aligning with concepts like Peter Kropotkin's mutual aid. However, critics argue it was not truly anarchist because the vacuum was filled by hierarchical, coercive triad power rather than purely voluntary association. The city exhibited spontaneous order in its architecture and infrastructure, but the underlying social structure was often exploitative and violent. It serves as a complex case study. While the state was absent, power structures, albeit informal and criminal, were still necessary to maintain equilibrium and enforce contracts. Life inside the walled city was characterized by extreme proximity and constant noise. Families lived in tiny, often windowless apartments, typically 250 square feet or less. Despite the cramped conditions, strong community bonds developed, particularly among neighbors who shared access to water pumps and rooftop spaces. Children often played on the rooftops, the only safe, open areas available. The lack of sanitation was a constant threat. Open sewage channels and rampant vermin contributed to high rates of disease. This environment forced residents to develop high tolerance for intrusion and noise, prioritizing collective survival over individual privacy. By the 1980s, both the British and Chinese governments deemed the walled city an unacceptable health and crime hazard. Following the 1984 Sino-British Joint Declaration, which paved the way for Hong Kong's handover, the decision was made to demolish the city. Eviction began in 1991. Residents were compensated based on their property ownership or tenancy status, a process that required extensive negotiation due to the lack of official records. The compensation package totaled 2.7 billion Hong Kong dollars. The demolition process took 2 years, concluding in 1994. Before its final destruction, a team of Japanese researchers meticulously documented the entire structure, creating the most comprehensive record of its internal complexity. The physical structure of Kowloon Walled City is gone, replaced by the Kowloon Walled City Park, which preserves some historical artifacts and the original Yamen building. However, its legacy endures in popular culture, particularly in cyberpunk fiction and video games, where it symbolizes dystopian density and technological decay. Urban planners study the city as a unique example of bottom-up self-regulating urbanism. It remains a powerful historical counterpoint to planned cities, demonstrating the limits of state control and the extraordinary capacity of human communities to create complex, functional systems under conditions of extreme constraint and legal ambiguity. The walled city stands as the definitive example of spontaneous, high-density anarchy.